Hello, everyone. Okay. Well, we haven't done one of these lives for a long time now, I don't think, but we're streaming to you live. And I'm David Limbrick, your Member of Parliament for the Libertarian Party for South East Metro. And I've got a special guest with me tonight, Jordan Ditloff, our Senate candidate for Victoria for the Libertarian Party. Good to see you, Jordan.
Yeah, good to be here. I think I'm sitting in Tim's former spot. I think that might have been the last time you did one of these was back when you weren't a single MP.
Maybe it was. So this week, there's actually been like heaps of issues. You would have seen if you've been following what's going on in the media and in Parliament and this sort of thing, there's been a lot of issues where there's actually a bunch of crossover between federal and state issues. And so that's why I thought, well, maybe it's a great idea. I can talk with Jordan about some of these issues because some of them clearly have a federal focus as well as a state focus, even though they affect our state. So welcome to you all. First issue, the biggest one of the week, is you would know about the CFMEU. You would have heard in the media. There's a big thing about corruption in construction industry, right? It's a big issue. These are all allegations. We actually don't know exactly what's happening yet. But what was alleged is that there's been companies that are effectively contractor companies, so labour hire companies, for example, that have deals with the CFMEU, and the allegations are that there was kickbacks in order to get jobs, get work on government contracts, which means that resources are being deployed inappropriately, probably taxpayer funds being wasted, and all of this sort of thing. So it's been a big scandal, and there's been lots of commentary both at a federal and a state level about this because it is regulated at a federal level, but of course there's a lot of state issues involved. It's mostly state government money that they're spending on these projects. And it's sort of been that the federal government said, yep, we're going to set up an inquiry. They removed the board and put in administrators in the CFMEU. And the state government said, we're going to set up some review or something as well, even though there was calls from the opposition for a royal commission, which has greater powers than what the government was proposing. And also this week on Wednesday, there was an attempt by the opposition to set up what's called a select committee. So this is a parliamentary inquiry, which would have members of parliament on it to investigate. That was blocked by the Greens and Legalise Cannabis and Labor, unfortunately. And that committee would have been a similar setup to a committee that I'm actually already the chair of, which is the Commonwealth Games inquiry, looking at the cancellation of the Commonwealth Games. That's also a select committee, but it didn't get up, and the opposition was very upset about it. I supported setting that up. And there's also another thing that I did. So I took an action on this as well. I'm not sure if you're aware of what I did. I wrote a letter to the Auditor General. And one of the things that the Auditor General can do is they can do a thing called an assurance review. And they don't need the approval of the government to do it. They can do it at the request of a member of parliament, and it's at the discretion of the Auditor General. Now, there's not many government or parliament agencies that you'll hear me say that I have a lot of faith and trust in, but the Auditor General is one. I've watched their work for a very long time now, and I saw the work that they did on the Commonwealth Games inquiry and other things. So I think that they've got a lot of value to add here. Especially, I asked them to look at procurement contract processes and how that's working with government, because that seems to be key to how organised crime is infiltrating into these government projects. And if you look back at history, Al Capone, they never got him on murder or extortion or anything like that. It was taxes. It was the auditors that got him in the end. And so I think that the auditors have a lot to offer and some insights, because one of the big questions with all of this is just how widespread is it really, and how much money is being wasted, and how much of these these project overruns that we've been seeing in Victoria, just about every project, see it goes over budget. Like how much of that is due to corruption being involved? And I don't think we have a good sense of that in Victoria just yet. But yeah.
Look, I totally agree. And I think with situations like this, one of the problems with what's been identified or what's been alleged is that a lot of times these companies are almost being set up as shell companies with some fairly dubious people behind them. You know, it's important to give people a second chance, obviously, but
Sure.
when you've got people in some instances getting out of prison, you know, a matter of weeks later, purporting to set up companies that then get massive multi-million-dollar deals with public money contracts and then sell it for a big profit, that's obviously very concerning. And you know, I have heard anecdotally, I've got friends who work on the railways and as rail contractors, and I think particularly with the airport rail link, there was one of the reasons that was said to have been cancelled or postponed indefinitely very early on was the real prevalence of things like no-show shifts, where, you know, you might have 4 shifts, 2 people show up, and the 2 that don't show up, that gets split between one party or another party.
Yeah,
when I say party, I'm talking about different actors within that space. So unfortunately, look, you know, what I know is that criminals and criminal enterprises can be incredibly creative and innovative. They're often not silly. They're not like what you see on TV, that they're sort of you know, unintelligent, unsophisticated operations. These are multi-million-dollar, you know, if they were listed on the stock exchange, they'd be multi-million-dollar companies, and some of their sort of organising minds work as tirelessly and as diligently as any CEO would. So it's not, I think people think it's like, you know, TVs or cartoon shows or whatever, but it's actually very sophisticated and a massive, massive drain on Victoria's economy. And that's ignoring the inevitable corruption that flows from that kind of public money sluicing through these projects. So yeah, you're right. There's a lot we don't know. And I think the biggest concern with all of this is that whether it's the federal Labor government or whether it's the state Labor government, the extent to which these inquiries or these processes are going to be at arm's length and be genuinely independent and genuinely fearless to report whatever they find, and to actually just not just look at the surface, but to pull, you know, follow the thread and see what unravels. I think that's really important, and it's a very, very big question mark how much that will take place.
Absolutely. And I think my other concern with these inquiries is that they're going to take a long time, right? You're not going to get to the bottom of this, especially when you're looking at forensic accounting and investigating people. This is going to take a very long time. And so what I did last week and managed to get some interest in it, and we've got an op-ed published in the Herald Sun on Monday, is try and look at, all right, well, what were some of the positive solutions, positive things that we could do now to disrupt organised crime in Victoria, because it's a really big problem in Victoria. And the thing that I came up with 5 things. So if you haven't seen it, it's on my social media, where I talk about the 5 things that we could do now to disrupt organised crime. Of course, it's not going to fix all of organised crime, but it would make a big dent in it. But the one related to government construction contracts, it seems that one of the vectors through which organised crime has gotten involved is through specialist labour hire. And you sort of wonder, why do specialist labour hire companies actually exist? It's because of government procurement policies, because they have these procurement policies. Now, in my view, procurement policy should really revolve around getting the best quality product at the best price from a company that can deliver, right? But actually, government procurement policies go way further than that. They say, you know, you need a certain diversity quota. So you need, you know, certain gender quota. You need certain Indigenous workforce and this sort of thing. And in fact, one of the things that was identified in the 60 Minutes report is there was an Indigenous specialist labour hire company that was set up. The claim is that there was some sort of corruption involved. And so I proposed that we should stop, or at least review, these procurement policies, because maybe they're not actually achieving the goals that the government set out or thought they were meant to achieve, and maybe they're actually causing unintended consequences and harm through what they're doing. So I think that should be something that we should be open-minded about looking at and potentially removing from these requirements for government procurement projects.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, perverse incentives are a very real thing. And when you're talking about public funds and this sort of often very unaccountable or very loosely monitored public funds, it's always going to be a big honeypot for these kinds of schemes or this kind of conduct. So yeah, I totally agree. And I mean, obviously, I saw to my great satisfaction, no surprise, that amongst the things you were calling for to fix organised crime in Victoria was to legalise vaping and to reduce what effectively amounts to prohibition or prohibitive taxes on cigarette excise. And that's obviously a big federal issue.
It's a federal issue
as well. And with all of these issues, even if something is happening just in Victoria, the way that the push-pull factors work, there's going to be importing coming in through the Australian borders, which brings in federal issues as well. So a lot of the single-use nicotine vapes that are flooding the streets in Victoria are coming from China and other markets like that. And so they're passing through Australia's borders, and they're sort of creating all this, I suppose it's almost like a supply chain, corruption and black market supply chain that goes all the way through from Victoria to international. So it's definitely a joint issue. And I think that you're right. If we reversed these failed policies that have never worked, will never work, you would put a big dent in the profit margins of organised crime. I think you'd probably make yourself pretty unpopular. We both would, I suspect.
Well, I'm sure they'll find other things to do. But like, if in case you're wondering, like, how does that work? Like, how does tobacco excise relate to organised crime? And what it is that the tobacco excise tax is so high now that it's unaffordable for most smokers. Right? They can't afford the retail cost of legal tobacco. And so that huge tax margin has created an incentive for organised criminals to smuggle in cheaper tobacco from different markets and then sell that and undercut the legal price. And of course, consumers want to save money, so they buy the much cheaper tobacco, not necessarily worse quality or anything like that. It's just not paying the tax on it. Basically, it's avoiding the tax. Similarly with vapes, vapes are totally prohibited. But you can buy them anywhere, the Chinese ones. And although we get the most sort of, fire bombings and this sort of thing like this. So the firebombing, if you're wondering, like, well, where does this arson come into it? Like, where does that come into it? What happens is you've got competing groups, like in any market, you'll have competing companies, but in this case, it's competing criminal syndicates. They'll be competing with each other, importing their own products. And when the market is building, they don't really tread on each other's toes because they're sort of filling the market. But eventually the market becomes saturated and they start treading on each other's toes. And as all libertarians would know, in a black market, you don't have peaceful means of conflict resolution. So you can't take someone to court. You can't deal with it through marketing or whatever. And so they use violence. And that's what's been happening, firebombing. But it has been spreading to other states. I know that there was a firebombing in Brisbane a couple of days ago. And I think that what is happening in Victoria, we're just sort of leading on this. And I think these other markets will reach saturation point eventually. And then my prediction is you'll see a lot more firebombings in other states as those markets become more mature, unfortunately. Yeah, which is a bad thing. Yeah. So, yes. So someone's actually made some really good comment here. The Laffer effect in real time. Yes. Yes, that is an excellent observation from Crystal. So if you're not familiar with what the Laffer effect is, or the Laffer curve, it's where you raise taxes, but actually the tax revenue doesn't go up because people in the market behave in a way to get around that tax, or you disincentivize economic activity. And in this case, yes, the government has raised tobacco taxes, tobacco excise, to an incredible level. But if you look at the budget papers, it's actually the tax revenues actually dropped off. That's because people are simply not buying the legal tobacco and they're moving into the black market. And yeah, that's an excellent observation of the Laffer curve.
Yeah, and it's a funny dynamic because people, like, for instance, my mum's a smoker. She always has been, unfortunately. But basically, my mum's in her late 60s. She's not going to go to the sort of chop shop tobacconist in Ballarat. Not that there's any left in Ballarat because they all got firebombed.
Right.
I should note, but I'm sure there's been replacement services that arise. But there will always be some consumers in the market who won't have the connections or won't have the incentives or aren't comfortable dealing with the black market. So the government isn't necessarily going to notice a hit in their revenue, which would probably cause them to think about what's going on. So they end up they get stuck in this loop of charging more and more tax to maintain the same tax revenue. But it sort of is just effectively gouging more and more a smaller and smaller portion of the market. And it's often, as we know with excise is a regressive tax. It really affects disproportionately the lower income earners in our society. So petrol excise, alcohol excise, tobacco excise, all of these things are often borne by the people who can least afford to pay them. And they also, contrary to common myth or perception, they all just go up into the giant consolidated revenue fund in the sky. They don't get quarantined or solely used for health or roads. We know that only about probably 60% of tax collected in a particular area goes back to that area when it comes to roads and when it comes to health and other things. So governments just can never resist that temptation to skim some off the top and redistribute it to other areas.
And when I made a joke when I was talking about this on social media about tobacco excise. I made a joke.
I know what you're going to say.
Yeah, so I made a joke about alcohol excise, and people were complaining about the price of a beer at the pub, and of course it's very expensive now, and lots of people can't afford to drink pints at the pub anymore. And I made a joke that maybe organised crime will start up in the alcohol industry soon, and people started coming back to me and saying, well, it's sort of already happening on a small scale, so maybe we'll be back to speakeasies and moonshine and stuff and imported Canadian whiskey like during Prohibition. I don't know.
Well, it's funny you say that, because this whole development and looking into, because I've been going out and speaking with former vape shop owners who have been basically criminalised with the stroke of a pen since 1 July. So we're only 1 month into modern day prohibition here in Victoria with vaping. And as I've been going and speaking with people impacted by that, both vape users and former vape shop owners, one thing that it sort of triggered in the back of my mind, I thought, I wonder whatever happened to this. Back in 2011, I'd say, in the second year of the Baillieu-Napthine government, they actually banned solariums. And I'm not sure if people remember.
I do remember that.
But that was basically this thing where there was a very aggressive campaign run by the Cancer Council at the time. There was a very publicised story of a girl who I think was spending 6 hours a day or something in tanning, like something nobody should ever do. And it certainly wasn't a safe use of what had previously been a very common regulated legal product. And so they banned solariums and they banned tanning beds. And I thought, geez, I wonder whatever happened to that. And I did a Google search of, solariums Victoria, and the first article that came up was in recent months there was a bust of a speakeasy solarium, like tanning bed with illegal tanning beds. So I think that's a really, in some ways it's a funny anecdote, but it shows how ineffectual this policy is and will continue to be. And it just shows you that 10 years on, we're still going to be dealing with exactly the same, if not worse, vaping-related harms and tobacco-related harms, but everyone loses. There's no winners from prohibition, except organised crime.
Organised crime gets protected by it, yeah. Melissa came up with another great example of the Laffer curve was the cruise liners. Now, this is a state tax. So the government, they're desperate for money in Victoria at the moment because we're almost broke. And so they had this wonderful idea where we've got a berthing tax for cruise liners that hop into port. And so they thought, well, we'll push up the berthing tax so that, when you stop in Melbourne, they've got to pay more money. But of course, again, these companies did the numbers and a bunch of them just said, well, we're not going to stop in Victoria anymore. And raising the taxes ended up with less tax revenue. So that's an excellent example of the Laffer curve again, causing these troubles. And
look, another interesting, and this isn't a product-related tax, but I think we could see a very similar thing happen if what the Allen government is considering does pass. So in my line of work as a civil litigator, we do a fair bit of wills and estates disputes, and they're looking at increasing the fee to apply for probate. So if your mum or dad or loved one has just passed away,
Yes.
they're looking at basically, in some cases, timesing by 6 the fee. Like, and that's insane to say that. Like, because I think the fee now, the last time we did it for a client, it was something like $500 or similar. Like, that's the kind of realm of the fee to apply for probate with the probate office. And they're basically saying, look, you know, you've just had this horrible trauma. You've just gone through the loss of a loved one. Before you can even begin to cover your expenses of paying for the funeral and start dealing with the affairs and managing the will of your lost loved one, you're now going to have to pay the government this egregious, excessive amount. And it reminds me of when we used to have death taxes. We actually used to have death taxes, and then Queensland was the first state to abolish it, and it just had this huge boom of retirees and people towards the end of their life moving to Queensland so that they wouldn't have to share a portion of their estate with the government. And it's almost like they're sort of trying to bring back death taxes by stealth. And so the best competition against these kind of regressive tax policies is competition. And the black market, in a way, is competition against government.
And so some of the other ideas that I put in that op-ed in the Herald Sun on Monday, and it got covered on television on Monday night because apparently the government, they were also reporting, or the media was also reporting about tobacco regulation in Victoria. And I made the point to the media that the government doesn't actually regulate tobacco in Victoria, organised crime does, which the media thought that was funny. But the other things that I spoke about, so we spoke about cutting tobacco excise tax. We estimate that's probably, tobacco black market's probably about $1 billion a year in Victoria, something like that. It's hard to estimate, of course. Vaping, we know from the Parliamentary Budget Office estimates that my team got put together, we know that's about $500 million market in Victoria. Another market which is controlled by organised crime is cannabis market. So I also suggested that if we want to get rid of that market, we think that one's probably another $1 billion. We could legalise that for adults. I know lots of people feel that legalising cannabis might lead to increases in consumption, but the idea that there's a whole bunch of people out there that really want to smoke cannabis in Victoria that can't get their hands on it is a bit fanciful to me. And we've already got one of the highest consumption rates in the world. So I think that, turning it into a regulated product for adults would also strip organised crime of that market as well.
As well as obviously decriminalising a whole bunch of some of the most peaceful law-abiding segments of the Victorian community.
They don't tend to cause a lot of trouble.
No. So, and I think we both noticed and made that observation when we were at the 420 rally, just this huge disproportionate police presence and some of the calmest, most relaxed, chill people in society. Meanwhile, somewhere there's probably a tobacconist getting firebombed or a car getting stolen. The police like, sorry, we don't have any resources. We're policing these very peaceful cannabis users. And I think if we look around the world, there's some cautionary tales about that as well, because in California, they have had for some time a legalized cannabis market that's regulated and sold for adults. But the taxes are so high that now they're having a very similar thing in
they got the same problem as we've got with tobacco.
Exactly. Yeah. So in California, Mexican cartels and other illegal sources of weed, cannabis use are essentially still flourishing because the taxes have gotten so high that that sort of curve is in play again. So I think, less is more, and that's something that's very difficult for government to understand.
And the final thing that I put in that op-ed, which is also a crossover with federal, although a lot of this is done at a state level, was the heroin market. So in Victoria, we've also got figures from the Parliamentary Budget Office about the size of the heroin market in Victoria. It's about $250 million a year. And one of the things that I've been talking about for a long time now is expanding pharmacotherapy options for people who've got heroin addiction problems. So what this means, if you're not familiar with it, pharmacotherapy is just a fancy name for opiate substitutes. Lots of people are probably familiar with something like methadone. There's also many other options like Suboxone, buprenorphine, and more recently, the government has committed to trialling a new option called hydromorphone. But it's my view that for every person that decides to make a decision to get off heroin and go on to an opiate substitute, yes, they're not removing their addiction, but they are having a chance to get their life under control, stabilize their addiction, and also get them out of the hands of organized crime, which is the really important thing. And hopefully, eventually, they'll get clean and get off the drugs. But getting them out of the hands of organized crime so that they're not dealing with organized crime, police, courts, and prisons, and instead they're dealing with their families, healthcare providers, and counsellors and this sort of thing. I think it'll not only be helpful for those people, it will save taxpayers a lot of money as well. I think just the costs for a single event of someone getting acquired brain injury for life from a heroin overdose. Lots of people, when they have a heroin overdose, they get low oxygen. It causes brain damage. It can damage them for life. And so I want to see as many people get off heroin and get onto these substitutes as possible. And the Victorian government, to their credit, they have actually committed to expanding that. But I said we need to accelerate, because I think there's a real urgency here. If you look overseas at what's happening, especially in the United States, with opiate markets being flooded with very, very high strength opiates, drugs like fentanyl and nitazines, which are far more potent than heroin. And you see, you've probably seen videos of these zombies walking the streets and people dying everywhere from overdoses. I'm terrified that that's going to happen in Victoria. We've already seen a little bit of fentanyl in the market, but luckily so far we haven't seen huge, large-scale fentanyl, but I'm very concerned about that as well.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, or perhaps not obviously, for those who aren't yet familiar with my story, I've struggled with drug and alcohol addiction in my 20s, and as of about 3 weeks ago, 9 years in sobriety and recovery, which is
congratulations.
Yeah,
9 years. Yeah.
I've basically been free from drug and alcohol use longer than I was using, so that's a pretty cool. Yeah, that's a pretty cool milestone. And so, yeah, I understand that with these issues, there's a big ripple effect when someone's in that crisis in their life, when they're in the midst of addiction that's not managed and that's not being treated or being moderated. You get things like theft, you get things like family breakdown,
sure.
You get things like increased costs for the criminal justice system, the medical health system, because people are coming in through overdoses, and it's just basically sucks up so many resources. And I can't remember what the figure is, but if there's some extraordinary figure that people who are in active addiction end up costing the system in just a purely dollar point of view, as well as obviously the social and community harms. But I do think that the harm minimisation route is the way to go. I agree with you totally. And there's nobody sitting in Victoria at the moment thinking, geez, I wish I could do something that is illegal. But I won't, because it's illegal. Like, anyone who is motivated and wants to engage in illegal activity is doing so.
So, Pierre, I apologize if I pronounce your name wrong, brings up a great point about nicotine pouches. If you're not familiar with this, in Sweden, there's a product called snus. They're like these little pouch things, and you put them in your mouth and they've got nicotine in them. They're similar to a nicotine lozenge. And they've been very, very successful in Sweden for reducing smoking rates to pretty much one of the lowest in the world. And it should be available in Australia, Pierre says, and I agree. It should be available as an option for people that want to get off the smokes. I'm an ex-smoker myself, and I gave up many, many years ago, and I didn't use the pouches or vaping and stuff. But I want options for people to get off the smokes, because it's a terrible thing. But look, I think it's really heartening that we're at a point where mainstream media is interested in publishing these sort of libertarian ideas, in the Herald Sun of all places, talking about, expanding pharmacotherapy, talking about options for tobacco excise and ways and cannabis for fighting organized crime. And I think it's a great development, and I'm very happy that the Libertarian Party is leading on this sort of thing. And I'm really proud of our party and what we've been able to achieve in shifting the narrative on these things. But talking about shifting the narrative, I know that you've been doing lots of campaigning really hard, like going around and meeting people and listening to what what people are concerned about, right?
Yep.
And you mentioned before that you went and spoke to an ex-vape shop owner now, I guess, which is sad that their business has been destroyed by the government. But what else have you been up to recently over the last few weeks?
Yeah, well, the couple of months that have passed since I first came in here with you and spoke to your audience have been frenetic. It feels like 12 months. The last 2 months has been non-stop. I've been going around to all different areas in Victoria to visit members and supporters of our party, and increasingly starting to meet with and listen to the public and hear what they have to say. A couple of weeks ago, I actually went to East Gippsland, went to Traralgon,
Right.
and I visited Traralgon because that's one of the sites of the proposed nuclear power stations that Peter Dutton's proposing at the Loy Yang coal-fired power station. And that was really interesting because we were able to capture some of the chats on video. It also rained because I made the mistake, which I'm learning as a candidate now. I made the mistake of saying it was a beautiful sunny day in the middle of Victorian winter, and of course it started downpouring rain like 30 minutes after that. So we got a little bit disrupted, but we got some really good footage captured. But there was also a lot more conversations we had that we weren't able to capture on film. We spoke to people from all different age groups, all different genders, really. Across the board, there was a broad open-mindedness. There was still a bit of hesitation around nuclear power. So I think there were people who wanted to know more about the safety element of it in particular. And I think that's partly natural and partly brought on by really active, very, I would say...
misinformation.
Yeah, well, exactly. I would say very unethical in a way. Scare campaigns and scaremongering. We've seen the Labor Party with these ridiculous Simpsons three-eyed fish. I loved Will Shackle's overseas adventures where he went to one of the areas where they had a nuclear power plant and went out on a boat. And he's like, "Where are the three-eyed fish?" I just loved that. That was so clever. But on the ground, people really seem to appreciate that, A, there's going to be a huge impact on their workforces when the coal-fired power stations end up closing down where they are currently. And B, that on days where the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining, and believe it or not in Victoria, that's a lot of the time, we need reliable baseline energy. If you want an option that isn't coal, that is reliable, sustainable baseload energy, nuclear just makes sense. So that was a great experience. I've also, as you said, recently been engaging with vape shop owners, so people who have been basically turned into criminals if they wanted to keep running their business with the stroke of a pen. Nearly all of these people are highly ethical, highly conscientious people who are committed to their market and their customers, and they are consciously doing the right thing. They've always consciously done the right thing, and often they've gone above and beyond as well. And they have never wanted to exploit vulnerable people or take advantage of things. Many of them in the weeks leading up to this prohibition felt really guilty because people were panic buying and really worried, and they actually almost didn't want to benefit from this situation that had happened. And one thing a lot of people don't know, and I didn't know, I thought that these new laws made things illegal that weren't previously illegal. So a lot of the focus in the media has been on single-use vapes and vaping for kids. Single-use vapes and vapes that contain nicotine have always been illegal in Australia. There's never been a point at which those have been legal. And the new legislation effectively makes something that was already illegal more illegal. And with it, takes a whole lot of collateral damage and basically eliminates all the legitimate competitors for organised crime. So in a stroke of a pen, you've basically gone from a mixture of legal and black market to now just black market having free reign. And that is the thing that's going to drive harms for kids and black market products more than anything else that could have been done. So I think that the real way to keep our kids safe and combat the harms to kids for single-use vapes is to put these legitimate vape shops back in business.
Yeah. And Dan said here, vaping helped him kick the darts and changed his life. And yeah, the thing that lots of people don't realize, and I've spoken to lots of vape store owners as well, just about every single one of them is an ex-smoker who used vaping to give up smoking, and they wanted to help other people do what they'd done. And so in many ways, the vape store owners weren't just people selling a product. They felt like they were helping other people and inspiring other people to give up smokes, and like it's very effective. Like I've seen so many people who've been chronic smokers, smoked their whole life, and then within a week they'll flip across to vaping. And no one's claiming that vaping has zero harm, but it's hard to imagine a product that has more harm than tobacco.
Yeah, and I want to stress as well that even a product that is as undeniably harmful as tobacco is legal, is regulated, and is available for sale for consenting adults. And I think we should push back against the idea that the only justification for allowing vapes to be sold is this idea of tobacco replacement. I think that just from a consumer preference point of view and a dignity of risk point of view, people should be free to buy and use products that might have negative consequences for them. And I think that this idea that vapes can only ever be justified as tobacco replacement, or that somehow Australians were catfished into thinking that's all they were, and then it became this kind of cool fringe market that the government's like, oh, we don't want consumer vapes. That's something that I really reject out of hand, because I can see now, I'm learning more about it, the way that a lot of these vape shops, it's all about the equipment and the kits and the flavors, and it's a very sophisticated consumer market. And I can't think of any basis on which they should be prohibited.
So we're getting close to running out of time, but there's another issue that you and I have both been working on, because again, this is sort of a state and federal issue around the Great Forest National Park issue. And this basically, there's a review going on at the moment. It's not certain what's going to happen with that review, but there's many bush people who use forests, so prospectors, horse riders, wood collectors, etc., that are concerned that the government might reclassify parks and restrict what those parks can be used for. And Jordan and I recently went up to Mansfield together. It was a great rally up there, and we spoke at that and got on the local television and local papers. I think there was about 400 odd people there. But if anyone is interested in going to, there's going to be another one in Kinglake. Details will be on mine and Jordan's social media on the 21st of September. So there'll be a rally there in Kinglake, but we can post details of that. And so a lot of people watching this maybe don't know you, Jordan. If they want to follow what you're doing and learn more about you, how can someone follow you and learn more about you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm on Twitter, or X, as at Ditloff for Senate. So that's TTF in Ditloff. And then on Instagram and Facebook as Jordan Ditloff Libertarian. And we're keeping all of my activities and content up to date on those platforms, and you can keep in touch with what's going on. And you can always also reach out to me on a lot of those platforms directly and shoot me a message as well. I'm very friendly. I'm very busy, but I always find time to reply. So, the next federal election is a huge opportunity here in Victoria to see a libertarian voice return to the Senate and re-elected. We did have a senator several years ago, David Leyonhjelm, and I think that the Senate and federal politics is poorer for not having a libertarian voice in it.
Yeah.
There's so many issues now that need a voice who's prepared to be critical of whichever major party forms government, because both of them will do very disappointing things that let down the majority of Australians when they think no one's watching. So that's our job, is to make sure that someone's always watching.
Yeah. And look, I would say to people, like, if you think about, lots of people are skeptical, what can you do in a minor party sort of thing? I would say that we've done a lot as a minor party in Victoria. We're leading potential solutions on a lot of these issues. We're changing the narrative and the discussion around these issues. And I think, for a long time, Victoria has really been lacking not having that libertarian voice at a federal level. And so I'd dearly love to see Jordan get elected once the next federal election happens. And I think it could make a big change for Victoria, because if we've got libertarians elected at both the state and federal and maybe even local level by then, we could be in a position where our voices can no longer be ignored, and those people that want to trample on people's rights won't be able to do it without, Jordan and I will be all over it. So, please follow Jordan on social media, and thanks for tuning in, and we'll probably do another one of these very soon. Great to see you.
See you guys.